Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Scandinavian warfare between the mid-11th to the mid-14th century. This is for the series of basic high medieval warfare videos introducing two more complex topics from battles to army organizations to military equipment. You can find all the playlists about various countries and regions in focus. And we did talk, in fact, already about Scandinavian warfare. I have a playlist dedicated to that, so you can check that out as well. And as we have profiled already in those videos, these centuries are, of course, like also the rest of, for the rest of Europe, of important development in an area, the far north of the continent, that historically had lagged behind and catches up during this period with, albeit still showing here and there some traits of Archaeism, and also being fundamentally a frontier one with other cultures that were even more behind. We're talking especially about the Ugrophins and even North America and so on. And so we start from actually the Late Viking Era, as you understand, where the same Scandinavian warfare had fundamentally advanced importantly from the previous centuries, right? The same Viking activity had brought to the unhingement of the traditional Scandinavian communitary system with the establishment of what we can assess by the 11th century, for example, in Denmark, a real state, right, of feudal nature. Christianization, and more, right? Ever large scale connections, contacts, trade, but also, in fact, military service with different cultures, including the Byzantine one, the Islamic one, and receiving, in fact, the influences of such cultures. Recently, I made a video about the English and Welsh warfare during the same period. And we have highlighted how in Britain there is definitely an important Scandinavian influence, not just before the Norman conquest, but also later on, and not just because of, for example, the Kingdom of the Isles, we will see in a while, and about which I made a video about its army organization, but also for the previous, what was factually the Anglo-Danish at that point, a military culture that Britain had, and that before the Norman conquest made it, let's say, a closer country to Scandinavian and continental Europe, and the Normans at that point having become identically Western Frankish and introducing that very advanced hierarchical professional factory system, at least in the elite element. That, in fact, changed a lot of things in Britain as well. I made videos about Anglo-Saxon warfare, so explaining also where Britain was coming from with its military culture and what in fact, the Scandinavian, mostly Danish influence really affected the country like, and what, in fact, can find also of Scandinavian in detail. Right after the Norman conquest, especially in the English North and, of course, in Scotland. We never talk about the Berno Norse, but we will have to do that too, because Ireland, as you know, was pretty much affected by Scandinavian colonization and more. So what we'll look at today are geographically the areas considered, however, as part of the Scandinavian military culture: Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, the Kingdom of the Isles, that is to say Shetland, the Orkney, and the Hebrides, and in part also the North Atlantic lands colonized or possibly temporarily settled by Norse people, including the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and perhaps also those ephemeral settlements in Canada We'll talk about this later because it's interesting. We have a tenuous but still significant evidence of that, and even of some finds, albeit this aspect is debated, we will see now, but there is something to say regarding the relations between the Norse and what they call the Skrellings, and there's actually a very ethnically varied group of Native Americans inhabiting, in fact, quite wide area. So by the mid-11th century, the Great Age of Viking expansion had ended. Ideally, we indicate 1066 as with the death of Harald, or rather King of Norway, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, as and eventually the Norman conquest of England, so of the Anglo-Danish world, properly the end. The Viking era is a bit Western-centric as a concept, even Scandinavianly speaking, because of course not much really changed in Scandinavia so quickly or readily or apparently. Most of what occurred in that sense already before the Norman conquest, and so the affirmation of a Western Frankish continental civilization in this era of the North is, let's say, in fact, a gradual compaction of continental powers after the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire and, in fact, the Renovatio Imperii, that brought peoples like the Norse, but also the Magyars, the Saracens, to fundamentally stop with what they were doing, because the targets had become too hard at that point to be broken. So those Norse that had settled in some parts, especially of the West. Today we don't talk about Eastern Europe, right? But you know that this happened also in the lands of the Rus, that are effectively a Norse Slavic policy, and we will talk specifically about that in another video, military-wise, but also more in general. Had been also absorbed by that continental culture, and that's what we were saying before about the Normandians specifically. We were talking about a core of Norse military settlers that we've seen it also recently in, for example, also in the other areas of Holland, of Frisia and surrounding areas that had been settled by the same empire to stem the Viking incursions, not always successfully, because these individuals always kind of adapted to the circumstances, and also the Continentals weren't dramatically loyal to the imperial ideal, as long as they could profit otherwise. In any case, you see that Normandy is a purely Western Frankish power. I mean, there is nothing about the army of William the Conqueror that can be said, oh, this is a Viking power of some sort. That phase is over, right? Aside from the biological continuity of especially the elite and some groups that you can see also ethnically at a point, or in the toponyms, speak about the Cotentin that shows very fair types and so on. This is effectively a Gallo-Roman Frankish and partly, in fact, Norse reality, ethnically speaking, that, however, from a political and social point of view, is purely Western Frankish. And brings, in fact, that dramatically advanced military culture was shared, especially in all the rest of the Western Frankish kingdom, was emanating basically in all the rest of the continent and even beyond, with the conquest of Britain in that context. And thus, and this is quite evident if you know also how the Anglo-Danes fought, and we have seen it in that video. And it's also the proof of that the superiority of that system. That is the same reason why eventually the same Scandinavia, basically, it's not conquered by anyone, but it Christianizes autonomously, it feudalizes autonomously, because of course their elites that had dramatically enriched through the Viking centuries, let's say, had been able, as we were saying before, to unhinge that kind of communitarian check and balance meant that existed also with actually a religious control in the pagan world over the various clansmen that wanted still that were the same ones who were making the thing happening, but avoiding others to step over them. Instead, the Scandinavian monarchies, with a different degree of advancement and chronologically, managed to surpass this and to establish properly feudal states. Needless to say, Denmark is the most advanced. I made a video about medieval Denmark last year, also one about medieval Sweden. We missed Norway. But in the videos about medieval Scandinavia, I generally discussed the differences between the three main Scandinavian countries, and I hope we will come back on them again. They'll have their own biases, we'll see now, which also in fact can help distinguishing the various influences, the different influences that the various countries received from different directions. Albeit, of course, the general trend is comparable. Denmark was at least superficially Christian at the end of the 10th century already, right? This was the Jutland power that had remained fundamentally under the Carolingian and Ottonian pressure, and therefore, in order to escape the various threats of invasion that at some point were actually carried out, and that brought to this the reinforcement, at least of the Danevirke, for example, or similar things also in the Anglo-Danish world. Think about Offasdag, who's more an Anglo-Saxon in that context, but already shows the capacity of this kind of proto-states to invest in significant infrastructure in a broader political and strategic fashion. But the most important thing, of course, was the political, moral, cultural compaction around the idea of a divine monarchy, of a state, of an administrative system that could facilitate the levy, that could, centralize to the degree of helping the country survive. Denmark was just closer to civilization per se, so the various trade services, even as we will see now with arms and armor, that are the ones that fundamentally adapt the quickest to the Western military developments. And that emerges, in fact, as a significant power that, as you know, already by the time of Knut the Great, 1014, 1035, temporarily had dominated Norway, southern Sweden, and England. Denmark, throughout all the Middle Ages, will remain the most powerful Scandinavian country, having this kind of more kind of imperialistic mindset. Norway, however, had also soon retrieved its independence. Danish rule over parts of southern Sweden, Scania specifically, but not only, like throughout, there was a capacity of Danish maritime infiltration that goes on, even as a sort of broader Viking naval legacy, as a modus operandi, if you want, that lasted, in fact, until the 17th century, where the relation is inverted. Sweden starts rising as, in fact, the major power in the north. Norway thereafter maintained a tenuous control over the Faroe Islands, the northern and western Scottish Islands, and the Isle of Man until the early 12th century. While the Faroes, Shetlands, and the Orkneys remained in Norwegian hands until the 15th century, when Scotland essentially claimed them for themselves, and Norway had basically just remained behind the broader competition for power. As I was saying before, I made a video about the military organization of the Kingdom of the Isles that also intervened, as you understand, in the Scottish mainland at some point, in fact, threatening to colonize further. There are much broader connections, as you know, during the Viking era that you can't even properly distinguish on the base of the single Scandinavian countries. For the Viking activity was very wide, so that you don't even have just Norse, you have Slavs, you have other elements. But generally speaking, these had been the various direction. Denmark had the lion's share and had been more interested in, say, maintaining control over bigger chunks of land. It could afford to do that. Norway was, is a bit more the explorer, because it had to find its own room, and that's probably where they reached and colonized the Americas by a certain degree, and all was in between. Sweden instead is darker, because we know less about that, but it was, however, still a bigger land than Norway. It was just more chaotic in a way. It took more to establish a state. We know that this had already emerged by the 11th century, but if you look at that medieval Swedish history video I made, you realize how tormented the entire process of establishing something like properly a firm monarchy was in such large but also internally fragmented land, right? Also from a strictly geographical point of view, I mean, there are important differences between the coastal areas are much more connected with the rest of Europe, and in fact it's those that Denmark colonizes, because they don't care about entering the Swedish hinterland, which is instead pretty brutal and wild. But as you know, at least in the Viking era, it's mostly the Swedes, but not only that, have the privileged connection with the great Russian rivers reaching up to the Caspian, the Black Seas, and beyond, and receiving in the process in fact seemingly the greatest Eastern influence, even from the steppes, and more we'll see it in a while. Now, the entire northern world, including an Icelandic state that had been independent since the early 10th century, that Christianized very peacefully, voluntarily, has a very interesting story, was united, however, under one crown by the Kalmar Union in 1397. This was essentially a Danish hegemonic project that really had a pretty labile grip, maintained mainly through dynastic formalism in a sense, but that kind of triggered more or less everybody, including very often within the same Denmark, because it's always a clash between the monarchies and the nobilities, right? So, but that is a very important chapter in Nordic history, and it has surely it contributed to bring the states forward from an institutional point of view, from an identitary point of view. Just today we don't talk about that because we stop to the mid-14th century. Scandinavian settlements survived in southwestern Greenland from the late 10th century until they disappeared, probably around the end of this period, like the end of the 14th century, say barely more than 100 years before Greenland was, say, rediscovered by Gaspar Cortereal in 1500. There is, as we were saying before, also this widely accepted theory for which the Scandinavians reached the mainland of North America. It's a certainty. The only problem that is still hotly debated is, say, the scope and the persistence of this Scandinavian presence in the New World, right? And regarding that, there's some evidence. Truly, something has come up again, but just to tell you how things normally work. There are mostly finds that have been associated with possible medieval Scandinavian colonization in North America. For example, the heavily corroded sword found near the Lake Nipigon in eastern Canada and northeastern United States area, the authenticity of which is generally dismissed, because this were found at times where hoaxers and were pretty interested in planting this kind of finds, or pretending, right, that even maybe original finds, maybe that actually came from Scandinavia, were just brought in contemporary times in North America to make the scoop of saying, we found finally some Viking weapon here. And the point is that these finds cannot be easily dismissed in the first place, because you can't really date with certainty, aside from the type of weapon per se, but let's say when whether these finds are actually really connected with local American finds, etc. It doesn't necessarily even have to be connected with a Scandinavian presence in North America, because by some degree, even if surely there were some transitory Scandinavian settlements in places like Newfoundland, and we know Scandinavian colonies in Greenland well into the 14th century, as we were saying before. Somebody may have traded with the Norse and brought those weapons that, by the way, were just ultra advanced for anything that the Stone Age cultures of North America had. May have, in fact, let's say, even treasured them in ways that were, in fact, much more important for the locals than for the same Scandinavians. Some of these words may have, in fact, even become objects of cult among the populations of the American mainland, right? What we see from the Lake Nipigon sword is rather probably, in fact, an 11th, 12th century sword with a peculiar looking pommel, the upper part of which also seems to have been lost. And there is a spearhead said to be from an unrecorded site in Wisconsin, and it is preserved at the Public Museum of Milwaukee, I believe. This one specifically was, say, found in an area of large-scale late 19th century Scandinavian settlement. And you know how much immigrant communities in that time in history, also with the the spread of rampant nationalism and beyond, like, cared about competing with each other and emerging and having this primacy. So also this find is commonly believed to be a plant or a fake, even. But even in this case, we cannot rule out that some indigenous people got it. Not even necessarily, from a local settlement, but having purchased it on a broader range, and in fact having worshipped it even to the point of allowing it to be much better preserved. Sometimes could have been possible even in the same Europe, given how common swords really were, in spite of how much they cost, right? So from the late 11th to the 14th centuries, Scandinavia, as we were saying at the beginning, witnessed profound military changes as any other region in Europe. The warriors of the so-called Second Viking Age, so we're mostly talking about the late 10th, the early 11th century onwards, were in contact with this impressive range of civilizations, from the Eurasian steppes to Constantinople, from the Islamic Caliphate to this Stone Age North American cultures. However, warfare is fundamentally the product of the local political and social organization. So what really remains at the core is a is a military culture dominated by infantry, using spears, swords, and long-hafted axes well into the first half of the 12th century. I never made a video about Viking military organization, Viking tactics, if not, for the presence of some Viking mercenaries in some battles that that we observed. So the question of Norse cavalry during the Viking era is at this point quite firmly scoped, and we assess definitely a great importance of mounted combat, and also, in fact, a quite large proportion of horsemen or mounted infantry, depending on, but properly fighting on horseback in battles, especially in this, in fact, late Viking era, but probably also from before. That even in the Vandal culture, the hero is typically represented in the perfect Indo-European tradition. In the rest of Europe, even among those peoples, in fact, historically had not had much of a cavalry, since, think about the Celts, the Romans, they were still fundamentally infantry-based armies. So, but still, the prototype of the hero was the horseman, right? And the way it's depicted also, that kind of migration era context, is still pretty much fitting the broader rise in importance of cavalry during the same time, and the primary role that, however, this had acquired after this great phase of upheaval, of impoverishment, of freemen, so the rise of elites that normally did hegemonize the battlefield from the top of their mounts, but that still could find, however, occasions to be defeated by infantry, for which they were also much more prone to dismount themselves. And this is something that we were discussing just recently regarding, and I remember a recent video I made exactly about this, but also one of the general awareness of the infantry potential by in fact the mounted elite at any time in history. So let's just say that the reasons why Scandinavia on average had less cavalry for sure than the continent, it's something that you can measure on the continent itself at different levels. It's fundamentally less surplus, so a somewhat more egalitarian community for reasons of wealth distribution that in absolute terms, is not even much great of wealth per capita, as we will see now. Also, for certain characteristics of the equipment that are unequivocally lighter than other areas in Europe, even for the infantry, for that matter. And also, actually, a difficult terrain, right? Norway is fundamentally mountainous in the hinterland. Sweden is covered in swamps, lakes, forests. Denmark has a better ground for that. And in fact, the Danes had, historically also, even arguably before, in fact, the Viking era, much of a kind of more of an equestrian culture than their Scandinavian kins. Denmark is much more like of a flatland. Yes, there were swamps, etc., but it was a much better ground for cavalry use, and so this also favored, in a broader sense, geographically the establishment of a more unchallenged, central power, if we can still use this term, in a feudal world. And in fact, a feudal world, as we were saying before, that becomes much more quickly so, much more similar, it's much more directly influenced, in fact, in Denmark, by the Frankish development than any other. But again, in a more general sense, yes, Scandinavia had a greater prevalence of infantry in their warfare. Not even just a stronger infantry per se, but let's say that especially the elite, and so what mostly allows us to document medieval warfare, of course, had functionalized its own panoply accordingly. And that's where you see, for example, the so-called Danish axe that was not actually Danish, but still fit much better that the military culture, because that's a weapon you can use only on foot, right? It's the same reason why, for example, in Germany you find around the same time kind of bigger swords, apparently, because Germany was a tougher terrain in first place. Feudalism was not as developed, say, as in France, and so I see there that, for example, 1.5 hand swords are actually more common than elsewhere in Europe, not because the Germans were taller, because we don't find this specifically in Scandinavia, where Scandinavians were taller than Germans, and there is not the same thing, but because of that kind of greater hybrid of feudalism, but still the difficulties posed by the employment of cavalry was still, imperial forces dismounting at some point in 12th century battles and so on, because of the natural obstacles and so on. So these are all things that we'll have to look at in detail. But that the archetype of the Scandinavian warrior wielding this massive double-handed axe is real, because they literally did it, given that most of their warfare was infantry-based, and so having an elite that has to be the equivalent of the punching force on horseback, that they would sometimes fight also from, and not naturally with a double-handed axe, at least wielded in that kind of mounted combat. But is the guy, again, managing to deliver that massive blow that a lance would be able to inflict from horseback, if anything, just because of the speed, but in here because of the two hands and the necessity of breaking, in fact, armor, because that was the ultimate point, or at least causing so much damage underneath to knock out, making people bleeding out from the within, and such things. So it's an extremely brutal warfare, and I can't stress this enough. Like, we're not overwhelmingly documented about the times and places for obvious reasons, but let's say, speaking of areas that were still kind of influenced by that kind of Norse archaisms, like, for example, the Highlands, the Scottish Highlands, that were lagging behind over time, both by British and Scandinavian standards, by, say, the late Middle Ages, even the early modern age. You see these guys that knew how to wield an arquebus, let's say, but they mostly fought for their political and social reality in the Highlands, still on foot, and with these massive axes, or also at that point double-handed swords, literally chopping each other to pieces on a regular basis in some of the most viciously traumatic things that you can imagine in the history of warfare, and that make you really understand what was the human mind before secularization and modernization, right? For the actual contexts that required functionally that type of engagement, and those were human beings doing it, not machines. So they were programmed to do that in a way that an average person today will, fortunately for them, not ever come even close to remotely imagine what it could mean vaguely to enact. So naturally, the same infantry formations were functionalized in that sense. We have this idea of for example, the famous shield wall that people, just they hear the word shield wall and they lose it. Everybody, I don't know how to tell it, to break it down to you, but every single military culture in the world used shield walls, and it's not even the shields that do the thing. It's the lances that do the thing, and it's the compaction of infantry that does the thing. And again, yes, every single people use the same thing, and the point being that we see during the Viking era, for armies that were mostly infantry-based, of course, a greater emphasis also given the fact that very often these were not massive armies. So they, as I often explained, they had to compensate with what they lacked in collective training. So also polities and societies that could be capable of fielding large bodies of collectively trained troops, because they didn't have enough centralization resources for doing that, with the individual strength. And so still there's nothing purely individual. Heroic warfare never literally exists in the single combat kind of dual stuff, ideal stuff. But we're talking about handfuls of, very close-knit, thickly packed wars would, in that sense, be overloaded in individual quality. That are the equivalent, essentially, of the continental masnada. Right, so the housecarls and this, fundamental retinues of the various warlords that were growing this time as de facto professional forces because they just spent their entire life fighting, right? So this is a bit the crypto-feudalism also in practice, and basically all the word functions still through feudalism in a way, but at the time, compared to Western Frankish standards, there weren't even massive differences, right? We see them, say, for a didactical purpose, considering how important they were at the time and which consequences they had later on. But if you really compare these peoples, well, they're pretty much really the same. There is not a massive divide, but there wasn't even between, I don't know, the Romans and the Germans or other peoples. We're talking about pre-industrial systems and more or less functional in the same way. The Viking era had finally, say, fully connected Scandinavia with the broader also military technological development. As always, it was just a matter of how the local politics and society could afford you to do. But it's obvious that the elite was always a hell of an elite, right? Don't get me wrong, these were extremely primitive and poor worlds. But as always, the elite tends to be the most updated, the most internationalized, the most enterprising, the craftiest. And that's how the Viking era happened, telling the truth. And why there was such a also rapid advancement, telling the truth, in the same Scandinavia. Consider that, as I always say, Northern Europe kind of grew in relative terms faster than Southern Europe during the Middle Ages, right? It was much more of a sudden change than what existed in the more developed areas, which means naturally that this capacity of also framing the countries, albeit very gradually and still basically in the Scandinavian case dysfunctionally throughout all the Middle Ages, but still, right, going towards that direction and considering the background, the one of statehood and permanent institutions and so on, is really remarkable. In Denmark, especially, as we were saying before, a highly structured military system had already appeared in the 11th century, right? This was based not very differently from, in fact, the Frankish one on training schedules that were essentially gathering the various vassals and as a political test first of all, but on the occasion in these fields, practicing together that degree of collective training we were talking about before, for which evidently the elites could afford, right? As proved also by the enlargement of their retinues. And in this process especially, there was a regularization of mounted infantry playing a leading role and effectively becoming on the longer run, the unchallenged, fully, Western, thickly packed, couché grip, and straight, charging, decisive cavalry that essentially by the second half of the 12th century affirmed itself on all the Western battlefields. There were, however, some important influences from other areas, as we were saying before, some of which are also somewhat neglected. For example, after the Norman conquest, many Anglo-Saxon refugees migrated from Britain to Scandinavia. So we are in the late 11th, early 12th century. As we were saying before, we find also a lot of Scandinavian connections in Britain, and even attempts, as you know, to, again, infest especially the northern shores of the island. And however, all these Anglo-Saxon refugees that didn't flee, by the way, just to Scandinavia, some did towards the Byzantine Empire, so much that, for example, they fought against the Normans, the Siculo-Normans at Dyrrhachion in the Imperial Army, right? And there are in Albania still some walls with some dragons that look unequivocally like the Draconis. So this relic of migration era standards in also depicted by the same Normans in the Bayeux tapestry for the Anglo-Saxons. And you know that the Scandinavians were, quite assiduous tourists in Constantinople as contractors, or as some of the finest. In fact, also as part of the Imperial Guard and Imperial Army. And not just that. I made a video about the Varangians, and we often again have just the image of the ultra elite Scandinavian heavily armored, double-handed, axed, let's say, warrior, but that was just the elite of these contingents, like you would find basically in any other army. This difference between mounted or dismounted warfare aside, but there were lots of Scandinavian, I mean really lots of them, also Slavs for that matter, in that specific Byzantine case, that for example were settled, but I'm talking in the thousands, as light, medium infantry, cavalry, whatever, all over the Byzantine Balkans. There is even kind of, say, a generic genetic trace of that in the Balkans. Countries like Serbia that also were very much in contact with Russia and much more influenced by Eastern warfare than suppose the neighboring Croats, that instead fit the Frankish orbit military-wise, but they're basically the same people. So you have this kind of deep interactions with the rest of the world. The point is that the Anglo-Saxon refugees surely were already part a bit of that, at least Scandinavian influenced military system. Still, their armies were mostly infantry-based as well. Many of them were also transitioning towards that kind of more proto-feudal system of the Huscarls that had supplanted the previous Anglo-Saxon, traditional Anglo-Saxon military system with the Thanes, with the idea of this functional militia. The fear was still there, but in a sense it had already declined, and it was just the levies, sort of militia-like, aside from possible internal, even in their segmentation, stratification, qualitatively speaking. And so they didn't have probably much problem to integrate and even or to properly to reinforce the Scandinavian military system, right? Consider that the Norman conquest of England brought to the significant end of most possibilities that the Scandinavians had to keep interfering essentially in Britain, right? And so it's a powerful blow. So that's why 1066 is objectively a meaningful date for that, because after it, Scandinavia especially Denmark, has to reorient its own political strategic aims, and what they end up doing is that they will keep their own Viking stuff going on just towards the Baltic, towards the pagans in the east, and participating, in fact, to the Crusades in their own way, but still with a practice that objectively is indistinguishable from the early Viking activities. Albeit again with something ever more solid, especially in Denmark, but also in all the rest of Scandinavia, to organize those expeditions, to making them become ever more effective, right? Albeit still these peoples do not have a concrete chance to expand much in the interland, right? The same Danish colonization that is the most successful is mostly coastal. Well, in the Baltic you can't really blame them. Not even the Teutonic Order could do much more than, because there was not much of a way to colonize the interland, if not by ravaging it and destroying it, and then only on a very long run thinking of annexating certain areas. But even Denmark would, they expand in northeastern Germany. They do very interesting things, but it's still not the degree of, say, overflow from Scandinavia that you see from, in the period of second invasions, right? It's a completely different parameter. They're framed within the Roman Church. There is a broader international cooperation and mediation, and so things are really different. Lamellar armor. I made a video recently about that, and it is worth mentioning this context because people, generally speaking, say it was more used in Sweden, which would indicate contact with Eastern Europe and beyond. The concept is absolutely fair. Like, you can see this is not say lamellar armor and other forms of armor of typically Eastern style, let's say, are to be found in the broader northern world, either in Scandinavia or wherever the Norse colonized, even in Britain. As a matter of fact, there is a debate over this. And say lamellar armor, also scale armor, there are two different things, let's say, but that they are witnessed, like in Europe in general, and also within the same Western Europe, as an influence from the East. Like, if you look longitudinally at Europe and you consider Scandinavia, then there is Germany, then there is Italy, you realize on this axis there is much more kind of scale armor, for example, on average, than countries like, in fact, like England, especially after the Norman conquest, France, or the Iberian monarchies. And so you realize that, yes, that there's a broader, especially steppe military culture that had deeply informed much of Byzantine or Islamic military culture that, by reflection, entered somewhat certain areas of Southern Europe and Central Europe, and that were often very close, actually, to the steppe itself. So it is possible that Sweden, of course, in the broader Scandinavia, was the area where you find really much more of that influence. Like from previous times, you even have graves of actual steppe warriors that had come to live there, so it's very interesting. But let's say we're not dramatically documented about this, so it's just a theory. It's a good one. For example, at the National Historical Museum of Stockholm, there is the beaten copper altar from Broddetorp Church in West Götaland. And one scene depicts the massacre of the innocents, providing with an interesting evidence, or at least a supposed evidence, of such lamellar arm. In fact, this embossed metalwork has been sometimes taken as evidence of such type of armor, but it's rather inaccurate artistically. So either the author was using an iconographic convention, was not maybe very used actually to see or conceive it, what a lamellar armor practically was, and consider that here there is a bit the trope of the evil Eastern ruler, because Herod is being depicted, and it's the weak soldiers of the king to wear such armor. So that this often overlapped in a sense with the idea that the Westerners had of the East, of the infidels. At this point, this altar was from the late 12th century, so it's a rather advanced time, and it's almost certain that in earlier centuries, again, Sweden used lamellar arm, and this because of the intense contact that the country had with Eastern Europe and beyond. So this specific Broddetorp altar, however, is a bit too vague, right, to say simply that this lamellar armor is just, a random evidence of what, see, it's represented because it was so normal in Sweden at the time. It was representing stereotypically the infidels as they appear also sometimes in lamellar armor in other 12th century European art. And again, even in that case, it's likely that that type of armor was actually used in the same West. It's just not necessarily something particularly frequent at that point. And we go by essentially discussing whether the glass is half full or half empty, so without evidence, it's not really, even in a statistical sense, it's not really interesting. Now, the longbow was an important weapon, seemingly in Norway more than in any other Scandinavian influenced area. The reason being, in my opinion, the fact that Norway had more naval warfare going on, and just like, for example, the Genoese and the Pisans as maritime republics seem to have pioneered crossbow warfare, albeit they hadn't invented it, nor really anyone had invented it even at the time. You would say that function, developed the instrument per se, because shooting at greater distance in naval engagements was a thing already, again, with longbows during the Viking era. And Norway has basically almost no interland because of the mountains. They are projected towards the sea. In fact, they are the ones, as we were saying before, that are more seafaring in general. So this may be an explanation, as a matter of fact, to create more volume of fire, and maybe also developing the performance of the same longbow on average, right? And also because in this sense, a greater proportion of missile would indicate on land less heavy infantry by a certain degree. Now, this may be true because Norway was basically the poorest of these countries. It may be the case, but in my opinion, it's more connected to something more advanced in that kind of, perhaps especially maritime sense. Consider also that composite or reinforced wooden bows of Eastern inspiration were almost certainly known, and Scandinavia had surely an important amount of them because of this Eastern influence. And in fact, such weapons remained popular also among the Lapps and the Finns for many centuries, right? If we can see some elements of backwardness or archaism in Scandinavian warfare at the beginning of this period, we can look at certain types still of migration era, arms and armor. As you know, in the Scandinavian tradition, swords have mostly a short curved quillon and a basically trefoil shaped pommel. There's a beautiful example of that. This sword hilt with yellow ornament from Laikimati, Finland, dating between the 11th and the 12th century. There are some bronze quillon from a Viking sword made in Scandinavia, likely dating to the 10th, 11th century, now preserved at the London Museum. And during the 10th to the 12th centuries, bronze sword mounts were less rare, like they were not particularly widespread, but still they were present, as in common as they were, amongst Scandinavian peoples more than elsewhere, especially in the core continental Europe. This also seems to suggest Eastern European influence, but it may have also been some sort of regional fashion in a way. Some, again, Archaeism still look at bronze in a way as a more status kind of viable, depending also how it was used, of course, because the bronze is inherently actually superior in many ways in arms and armor to iron, but there were some enhancements also in steel technology that were changing the story. But just generally speaking, bronze speaks at this age of something somewhat out fashion, right? and also because of the broader needs of standardization, a greater amount of weapons that were more easily producible and employable. But we are past, far past the bronze employment on a common scale. The aforementioned Danish axe was a beautiful example found near London Bridge. This is Scandinavian as well, dated to the 10th, 11th century. Also preserved at the London Museum. And this would represent a typical Danish axe head. Such weapons were, of course, not used specifically just by the Danes or the Vikings. They seem to have been actually a Carolingian weapon that the Norse gradually acquired for the aforementioned strengthening of their own elite, and so their armoredness, by the migration era, even peoples as the same Anglo-Saxons, so, towards the north of the Germanic eras, display just in their material culture less wealth. They have even very often smaller shields. They're less compact, right? So what Scandinavia undergoes in these centuries is much more important than is commonly believed. As gradual as it was, this axe specifically has no upward sweep to the blade, rather it has a slight downwards one, which for this reason is sometimes called also a bearded axe, right? And these are weapons properly meant to chop down whatever the hell you have in front of you, as especially one-to-one combat, or just in the melee, broadly speaking. They're not really anti-cavalry weapons, as somebody says, in the idea of charging, stopping weapons, but definitely, whenever cavalry, had carried out the charge and this stopped, like, this man could attack the horseman in his more vulnerable condition and chop him down to pieces, horses included. There is a scene of that happening also in the Bayeux Tapestry, and of course whatever can happen in combat is a possibility, is a distinct possibility. Just remember that cavalry is stopped exclusively with pikes, right? There is no other weapon that stops cavalry as a compact mass. Light infantry in the forms of missile infantry doesn't do that, right? There is no army in history that does this. You have to wait the 18th century to have something like that for firearms, and just putting definitely in crisis cavalry at the end of the following one with automatic weapons. But the idea is that there is no other weapon, literally, that stops it. So, of course, the Danish axe could be used by different types of troops. Surely the axe in general was a common weapon in Scandinavia. Just a lot of wood to chop and a lot of people to kill in general. Even in the more less Viking involved interland. But again, the brutality, the instability of the system is pretty much homogeneous. So even to trace a difference doesn't really make much sense. And it's just, of course, there would be smaller axes for more menial jobs, let's say, and some axes are much more specifically work-oriented than fighting or combat-oriented, but sometimes we find even some adjustments that are a bit of a hybrid of the two things, so we can imagine that kind of interchangeability. The point being, though, that the bulkiest, greatest, massive, more massive double-handed axes were, of course, weapons that were quite expensive, especially for the sake of being effectively trained with them, right? So the ultra elite, that was the only one that gladly approaches at close range because it's the most heavily armored, but has in this sense to strike other heavily armored people, would be the most likely to be trained professionally to deliver such blows, to be also the kind of the best trained, most athletic, and so on, because it takes really a lot of physique to use these weapons. Some of them are really huge, and again, the objective is breaking armor, right, or damaging it to the point of further blows, facilitating the task of killing whoever is using it. The same is, telling the truth, valid also for swords, as I often point out. Like, it's not that swords actually pierce through armor, but the concept is that armor in weapons develop essentially to neutralize each other in a technological way. Because if they had neutralized, if they had, let's say, surpassed each other, well, that either one of the two would have disappeared, because it would be another adaptation, right? So this is a bit what happens eventually just with firearms. In the 16th century, armor gradually disappears in a functional sense. But throughout all the Middle Ages, until even the same firearms, where, surprise, surprise, plate armor comes around, you have not just armor improving to be ever more resistant, but you have swords becoming ever more cutting, ever sharper, right? So surely they weren't going in different directions. They were meant always to be one in function of the other. And so, yes, swords were meant to cut through armor at the best of their possibility, naturally damaging themselves as well in the process, but still, right? And still, again, the damage that could be delivered underneath the armor, doesn't matter how much padding you had, sometimes was dramatic, right? So broken bones. Well, what really makes you wonder is of all these kind of promising science, thrown in combat, like how many crippled individuals that would be also relatively of not much of a good use like before, like in combat, would exist normally in this combat. In fact, we have an indication of that as well. But sometimes, killing is a matter, actually, most of the times, if not always, it's a matter of how much you hate the person in front of you, not how much crippled even you are, of whatever you have in your hands for that matter. So technology, telling you the truth, has a very limited role in the whole business of war. There is a beautiful image of a warrior from a carved elk horn from Sigtuna in Uppland, dated to the 11th century. This is preserved at the Historical Museum of Stockholm. And what strikes the most is the helmet, which is represented as huge and also rather too curved in outline to exist literally in that fashion. But aside from the conical form, the long nozzle, what really strikes is the exaggeratedly large rivets, indicating that this was of Spangenhelm construction. So that's an archaism. While, as you know, helmets were evolving towards other construction forms. We have a decorated brow piece of a helmet from Lokrumen, dating from the 10th, 11th century. I don't know what this is preserved today. So these are decorative brow pieces, common in early medieval helmets, migration era helmets. And it's possible also in this case that this fashion was more persisting in the north of Europe. And naturally, the function was also partly reinforcing the top of a nozzle, where the brow piece met the rim of the helmet. Now, the 12th century, as you know, is a moment of important acceleration in the development of Western arms and armor, and this basically accelerates also with time coming until the end of our period and beyond. So by the mid-12th century, Sweden had been coalescing too as an important state in spite of all its flaws, but let's say also in panoply you see that Swedish warriors had been drawn in the mainstream of Western Frankish military culture, which also means, by the same fact that this is documentable, which feudalism was kicking in there as well. Denmark at this point is also practically indistinguishable, if not for minor details in panoply, from any other European feudal state, militarily wise. As we were saying before, Denmark had shifted its imperialistic aims towards the Baltic during the mid-12th century. Danish armies had now a consistent amount of cavalry. By the 13th century, also large amount of crossbowmen, which again reveals the full development of the Western tactical practice also in the Jutland by this time. Crossbows were spreading throughout Scandinavia by a different degree. Of course, the hinterland, as we were saying before, was more traditional, more rustic, but still the constituted authority was, carrying out throughout the extension of the feudal prerogatives and the introduction of an effective taxing system, the possibility of levying important contingents of military professionals in exchange for the rest of the people to essentially just pay a sum to avoid direct military service. I made a video about the traditional Scandinavian levy, originally used for mostly naval expeditions during the Viking era, and we see how this was gradually monetized, not differently from most areas of Europe, right? And so that, albeit of course the feudal levies and this broader still original Germanic levies, right, were juridically legitimate, like the practice of it and the convenience of it had been superseded by the broader feudal system. So more quality, less quantity, the crossbow is so important that becomes a central and almost mystical feature of the Kalevala. This is the Finnish national epic. So this weapon's very often supplanted also in the broader mythology, turning into history, basically in these countries. By now, the bow that had always, as you know, also in the Germanic epos, we made videos about that, always represent a bit like the evil, right, of the world, always the price of the fallen kind, right? This idea of treachery, of something that is gradually eroding the world at its rotten roots, and that eventually will take out even the greatest of the warriors. So there are important examples of these times. Like, speaking of 12th century panoply, the loose chessmen that are essentially an Hebridean Norse source from the essentially the 3rd, 4th of the 12th century, today preserved at the British Museum in London, are of extraordinary historical relevance for the military equipment of the 12th century northern lands. In fact, the best source, telling the truth, because they are, in fact, chess pieces. They're tridimensional. You can see that they're a bit stilized, as you'll see now, but they really depict in detail. I have inserted the pictures, even you can easily recognize them. I always use them normally when I make videos about Norse warfare. So you can see, in fact, conical helmets in single piece, with or without nozzle. The fact that these are not standardized is also very useful for us. 4 pieces have pendant ear and neck guards, and this means that this elements were attached by leather hinges, or perhaps directly to the lining. 2 helmets seem to be flat-topped, but this may be just how the carver realized the pieces technically, so may not really represent anything consistent. One piece also has a rim riveted around the base of the helmet, interestingly enough. There is another helmet made from 2 or more sections joined horizontally, which may be a sort of local style chapelle de fer, war hat. Consider we're talking about the Kingdom of the Isles, right? So something really special in terms of, these were some of the least developed areas of Europe. So the fact that these technologies were still represented there really speak for the broader connection still an updated list of some elite, or even not necessarily. I mean, the chapelle de fer was, surely an expensive device, but also sergeant could wear it, as we will see now. There is a male hauberk showed in the loose chessmen. Shields are the tall kite-shaped variety with flattened or rounded tops. A cavalry lance is shown, however the most common weapon is a straight sword with straight quillon, so already kind of a bit more of a Western fashion rather than the traditional Norse one, and a large, usually nut-shaped pommel, right, which also hints towards the direction of, also a greater professionalization of the swordsman, because that fundamentally the evolution here is that the fact that you can do more, you can handle more precisely, more versatilely the sword, right? And this eventually the pommel, the grip evolved towards also larger sword, 1.5 swords would have larger pommels, so you can have enough room for using also another hand delivering more powerful blows. We will see how this evolves from other sources in the same Scandinavian now. There is another beautiful evidence that is the Hillestad carved wooden doorway in Norway, dating to the 12th century, showing Sigurd the dragon slayer, so from the Norse mythology, and the figures depicted here are evidently the same in style of the one of the loose chessmen, interestingly enough. Conical helmets with nozzles, long neck guards, and even earpieces. The shield is a tall kite-shaped one. The swords have long straight quillon and round pommels of the Western type. Even the scabbard is hung in the normal Western European manner. There were other ways that the Scandinavians had, more, empirical and customized and primitive, if you want, that are documented in Britain as well. In fact, if you look at the aforementioned medieval English and Welsh warfare during the same time, I talk about them. The only significant traditionalism perhaps is the pendant ear and neck defenses, right, that are not to be found in much of continental Europe. We can point out some other aspects of backwardness before passing through to the advancements. For example, there's a sword with inlaid decorations on the blade from Scandinavia, dating to the 11th to 12th century. This is preserved at the Musée de l'Armée in Paris. This seems like either an early type, or perhaps the dating is not correct, because the sword is rather tapering with a pointed blade, and that this type of weapons normally developed later as more armor came around, so that they were designed to kind of find the not much to cut but to thrust, compared to before. It has long quillon, round pommel, right? The only point being in Scandinavian flavor, the decorations on the blade that were a typical tradition, that stemmed from this greater also pagan Christianity hybrid ambiguity that lasted for a longer time in Scandinavia. So engravings that, of course, were meant to be some sort of apotropaic additions to the swords and kind of magic power added to them. And by the 12th century, many fully, what can say that, full, not even today, Christian European knights were still believing basically the same thing. From the late 11th century, we already have important evidence of Danish weapons being influenced by the more advanced German styles. Naturally, some of them were German imports. And there is one reconstructed at the National Museum of Copenhagen, showing, say, new, longer, more slender Kion, the oval pommel, as an element of, transition. Consider we have another sword dating from mid-12th century Denmark, still preserved at the National Museum of Copenhagen, that surely displays such mid or late 12th century, actually, standard kind of Western style, and we don't know in this case whether it was either it was Danish made or German made. The Baldishol tapestry is a late 12th century Norwegian, fabric that is being called a bit like the Norwegian Bayeux tapestry. It's more modest, of course, but it's a beautiful source. It really overloaded in color, very cleanly representing. In fact, the military equipment on Norwegian knight, in the 12th century. This is, as far as I know, at the Museum of Applied Arts in Oslo, preserved. And it does show some kind of old-fashioned and backward panoply of Norway at this point. And you may expect this from a relatively poor and rather isolated country. The horseman is showed with a conical helmet, with a nasal and perhaps a forward-angled crown. The helmet is perhaps made in two pieces, directly riveted, a bit like it was normal in Eastern Europe at the time. The knight wears a long-sleeved male hauberk and coif, but he lacks mittens as well as leg armor. The latter aspects are also witnessed in Britain, especially in the north, and they are relatively common in these areas that could afford just not the entire panoply. There are interesting things in Europe. I'm always struck by the depiction of a Transylvanian knight in the 15th century that has basically what should be a full-plate Milanese armor, except he has only the upper part of it. Like the legs are not there, and this naturally means lots of interesting things. First of all, that again the full panoply was not just the fact that it's depicted on the tapestries, that the full panoply was more optional also conceptually in a world like the Norwegian one in this case, but we can presume also most of Scandinavia. Secondly, it may counter what we were saying before regarding the power of infantry. Yes, we are in the late 12th century, so this is kind of a more advanced stage. But we can wonder why this is after all. This is a cavalryman, right? So he may have been also boarded on a ship and fighting from there. So maybe you didn't need the full panoply at a distance, but is also actually debatable, because if you have to board, you really want, but maybe you want to avoid to sink more speedily if you fall in the sea. Well, I'm just really using my imagination now. No, that doesn't seem to be any specific connection. Perhaps this is just one evidence, but it could mean, yes, a more affirmed mounted elite that a bit because it cannot afford more armor, and a bit because, generally speaking, cavalry is taking over the masses, may have opted for not having leg armor of sort. This Norwegian knight's shield is also of the late 11th and early 12th century, round-topped kite-shaped variety, so somewhat outdated by the end of the late 12th century. And a round shield with a boss may even be seen from the side, just in front of his horse as well, so suggesting that this type of older form, as you know, this was the most common during the Viking era, and since the Migration era, telling the truth, was still around and would be depicted in this impressive work, by the way. So that was commissioned definitely by someone that knew his way around arms and armor at the time. We have a mid-13th century painted wooden ceiling from the wooden church of Torpa, Hallingdal, Norway, representing the story of Saint Mary of Antioch. And there is a very interesting figure, probably reflecting the typical armament of either knights or sergeants in mid-13th century Norway. And there is this uncertainty exactly because the arms and armor are relatively light, consisting of a broad-rimmed but apparently one-piece chapelle de fer warhead, mailcoif, hauberk, and chaus. Even more strange in a sense is the very large and long shield, actually multiple ones depicted. This is odd because you know that shields came to be ever smaller over time, especially by the mid-13th century. They had turned into something rather small, just the size of your upper chest and of triangular shape, because the spread of armor was rendering the same shield kind of useless, starting from the leg armor that, as we've seen, just a couple of generations ago was missing from the Baldachol tapestry. And the fact that the shield is so large is also suggesting some kind of broader anti-missile, broader cover thing, which, if it weren't for the fact that we said that Norway had perhaps more longbows around, wouldn't make much sense. And still, in fact, it doesn't seem to be a valuable explanation, because the entire military technology was going towards the strengthening of armor, and so you can not really say that in Norway there were larger shields because there was more longbow use. Doesn't make much sense. Too mechanistic, telelogistic, and technologistic, and also kind of too impractical. This may be an artistic license, of course. Some have suggested, however, that again the armor was a bit less developed in this context. While in this period in continental Europe you see the spread of plate armor that we will see will actually arrive and take root in Scandinavia quite immediately, right? Really by the 14th century there is no difference between knights all over Europe, at least in the West. In the East there are particular styles, but let's say especially the elite was pretty much the same thing all over the West. We can't distinguish anymore. There may be some kind of lack of semi-rigid body armor in Norway, right, for some reason, but this also doesn't sound particularly satisfying as an explanation. The meaning being that, there is studded armor that comes on, like some proto-brigandine, the idea that you have lamellar plates, mold plates, that eventually will be compacted in entire, larger plates in the evolution of armor, right? So elsewhere, this was being experimented, so conferring greater strength to armor and reducing the need of the shield as well. The swords are normal. Actually, they're long and straight, with long, slightly curved quillons. But this thing of the larger shield, especially for knights or sergeant, is really not really clear, right? You know that there are pavises around. Telling the truth, at this point, they're not the sizable weapon that you're habituated to think, especially from the latter Middle Ages. Like the pavis has probably its etymology and meaning from the fact that it's very thick rather than large, right? And while it is true that in places like this broader crescents, say from the Balkans to Eastern Europe, to counter steppe warfare, archery, and also in Italy, where eventually the most famous type of pavis that is actually earlier documented in Lithuania, but not seemingly making that dramatic evolution that eventually from Italy actually takes over the rest of the continent, where there was a lot of crossbow volume of fire really that's needed this kind of development. The pavises were somewhat small even. We know there is a very few from the time, but the few documents that we have regarding their size tells us they're very precise, because they are the actual orders of some pavises, tells us that they were not big at all, right? So before we were mentioning Genoa and Pisa in relation to Norway by saying, there's maybe some maritime bias here. Well, I don't think it's that big in order to develop such large shields that actually at the time are not even documented. In Germany too, there is the Zets shield that is used also by Frederick II to counter a bit prescriptionally the Mongol invasions. But still, we don't. So the idea of something that was bulky enough to be fixed on the terrain and to be some kind of mobile fortification used by the infantry protecting from arrow fire, but we don't see anything extensive and massive in any European source of the time. So my best take is actually this Torpa paintings are just some sort of artistic license. I don't believe that there were such large shields, just habitually at least used, especially by knights, in that fashion. There is, from the early 14th century, painted altar front of the Nes Sogn in Norway still, today preserved at the Historical Museum of Bergen. A rather, in fact, confused figure showing a warrior wearing a bassinet. The figure clearly wears also a long-sleeved male hauberk with mittens and male shoes. And to the latter, some pollains for the knees, as you know, protection, are added. And there may even actually be some very weird depicted greaves. So even about this evidence that surely displays common pieces of panoply, but still in an odd way, we can't read either the depiction of plate armor by an artist that didn't really know what this really looked like, or the fact that we are looking, as it often happens, we don't know what material is actually being represented. Some have proposed even some kind of hardened leather, semi-rigid material that could deform in a way, which is also not so typical after all. What is typical instead are the swords, having the teardrop pommels and long slender quillon. The armor is somehow strange. But speaking of kind of more advanced panoply that we do find in Scandinavia, start from this time, mostly because of imitation of what was happening in the rest of Europe. We see, for example, still in Norway, today preserved, however, at the National Historical Museum of Stockholm, a chapelle de fer, known also as kettle hat, which is display. I have inserted it together with the in the maybe you can see. Yes, it's in under the Baldish Hall tapestry. I imagine it's the replica. Telling the truth, I'm not sure about that. And it's a pretty bulky, round thing. The chapelle de fer was popular throughout most of the 13th century in Western Europe, but some have actually suggested that it may have, if not originated, at least however have been used in some earlier form in Scandinavia. And some have gone as far as saying that the romantic idea of the Vikings with horns, which, telling you the truth, could have even happened because, it's plenty of horned helmets everywhere in medieval warfare and also in ancient warfare, etc. But that's another thing that we're not discussing today. But this kind of winged-looking helmets may have been called horned, so in some kind of literal, adaptation, right? In fact, there are these broad rims which could have been described as wings, maybe in a polite way, but I also think this is actually it's not a correct suggestion to have made that kind of impact. But it's still remarkable that that kind of lighter type of helmet maybe is witnessed in Scandinavia for the aforementioned reasons of the same reason why the Baldish Hall tapestry knight doesn't have the leg armor, right? They were kind of lighter, so maybe they were more a thing in Scandinavia statistically than we don't know. But seemingly there was maybe something earlier going on in Scandinavia as well. There is a beautiful sword from the Gudbrandsdal in Norway, dated to the 40s of the 13th century, preserved today at the Museum and Art Gallery of Maidstone, England. And this is a typical weapon of Europe at the time. It shows that by the mid-13th century, the military elite of Norway was equipped in a completely identical fashion as in the rest of Western Europe. But there are really many other beautiful sources. For example, a carved relief in the Cathedral of Linköping depicting the massacre of the Innocents dating to 1300. And this shows a soldier in some kind of scale armor. This one looks rather realistic and also similar to some, in fact, scale-covered coats appearing in Polish and German art. And these are not worn just by the evil, wicked characters of the Bible. So they may more realistically depict a common type of armor. In Sweden, that may be essentially a prodrome in the coat of plates development that was really spreading in Europe during the period. The same warrior has a long-sleeved mail hauberk with mittens, a mailcloth, and a round cervelière helmet. The sword he wields is tapering, so in line with the broader kind of thrusting direction against the armor joints that is somewhat increasing at the time. It has curved quillon and also diamond-shaped pommel. The latter's feature specifically being seen in Germany at the same time. Consider that Scandinavia at this point was being literally overrun by German mercenaries, right? That took over even at some time, at some point in 14th century, Denmark, Sweden, etc. This is a thing going on throughout all the late Middle Ages. There is another beautiful representation of soldiers in the painted wooden altar front from Nedestrin, Nordfjord, dating to 1300, especially the figure of Heraclius with the true cross. This is preserved today at the Historical Museum of Bergen, etc. We have the extraordinary find at Visby relative to the battle consumed between the Danes and the Swedes there in the castle in 1361, which has provided us with a remarkable lamellar cuirass. We were discussing it recently in the aforementioned video about lamellar armor. In fact, it's one of the most interestingly preserved evidence of the time, examples of the times, and specifically in a non-Eastern European country. Probably the armor was created a generation before. It may date to the the second fourth of the 14th century. Specifically, today it's preserved at the National Historical Museum of Stockholm. It's the Visby armor number 25, famously enough. This comes, as you know, from a mass grave of dead Swedes and other defeated at the battle. And we don't know why they weren't stripped of the armor. Maybe because they had some plague or something, so that the winners didn't want to touch the corpses too much, and they just buried them all together with the armor on. And in its original state, this lamellar cuirass, in which the individual lamellae are laced together in a strikingly similar way to the lamellar armor that we know in Eastern Europe at the same time, but also in Asia and Islamic world, may have in fact even had flap-like sheets still in lamellar to protect the shoulders and upper arms, right? So one says, wow, we are in the 14th century. We know that lamellar armor was somewhat common in the migration era and in other times like this, and probably Scandinavia was very influenced compared to other European countries. But we didn't expect it to find it in fact in such a context necessarily. It's an exceptional find, really. And in fact, we believe that it may have not properly even been Scandinavian. It may have, as a matter of fact, been made either in Poland or in Eastern Europe proper, and just being purchased by someone in Sweden, in Gotland at the time. We were considering that the close trading contact that existed with the island and other Baltic countries. And the particularity of this armor is that it had lamellae riveted together, thus forming a sort of coat of plate. So it's part still of a broader development that, as we were explaining in that video about lamellar armor, fit not much, say, the fact a sort of lamellar model per se, but the fact that there were some structures that could be eventually filled eventually with different type of armor, like scale, mail, etc. And so there are these kind of hybrids. Even the same material could be, in fact, could vary greatly, as you know, especially in areas that not much in Europe where metal at this point has taken over practically completely. Albeit there is some kind of ladder here and there, but the idea is that the direction is towards the heaviest armoredness in history for infantry in the 15th, right? And the main plate armor at the time was developing in a ever more enveloping form, and so all these different types of armor participate in this broader enclosure. Naturally, the Visby graves have provided us with other types of armor as well. For example, there is an important number of shoulder plates from cuirasses or coats of plates from the same find, and in one we find even the arms of the Flemish Rorda family, which means that the armor itself may have been imported from Flanders to Sweden. And by the way, it consists of notably large pieces of metal. And you know that Flanders were rising also in, they were quite wealthy, and materially wise, they had a lot of exports as well, in arms and armor, and this would go on for a long time, also in early modern times, for countries like, in fact, even the same England, but also other northern countries that normally didn't have too many resources. At least in the case of Sweden, actually iron was being mined consistently, and so that's also what most of the Kalmar Union revolved around. And the Danes wanted to maintain control on the not on the mines that were in the interland, but at least on the fact that they controlled the coastal areas from the ports of which that iron could be exported. So it was a way to control the interland indirectly through that measure. So there are interesting developments in this sense. There's a beautiful sword from the battle site of Nonneberg in Denmark, dated to the 40s of the 14th century. This is preserved at the National Museum of Copenhagen, and it's corroded. Telling you the truth, it has lost the tip in the process, but it's a beautiful piece, and the length of the hilt, especially, so that is naturally commensurate also with the entire structure of the sword, that even if it's not intact, we can reconstruct because of the broader balance that these weapons had, ergonomically speaking, is probably an early example of a hand and a half sword, which could be grasped with both hands, and that could thus deliver a more powerful blow. There were different types at this point. Actually, the double-handed one was already in since, as you know, the end of the 13th century. But this other kind of in-betweens, like, were ever more important because armor was ever more performing, and so you needed this bulkier weapons, aside from others that, aside from swords, that could allow to disintegrate, let's say, the unity of the armor as it was being built in the various pieces altogether. So at this point, you understand that Scandinavia has pretty much the same technologies elsewhere, affordable by the elite, and there is hardly any difference with the rest of Western Europe, except maybe again a tiny bit less of material available, right? But not to make a considerable difference. Also, there were lots of mercenaries actually fighting there from Germany, as we've seen before. So the distinctions really were virtually insignificant. As we were saying before, there is a broader Scandinavian frontier and outskirts, let's say, that are very interesting to observe. These were literally the fringes of the northern world. It's a fringe, it's a northern fringe, as opposed, there is a Celtic fringe, there are other fringes also in the steppes. This is a bit in between geographically. We're talking about the areas of Finland, Lapland, Also among the neighboring Finno-Ugrian peoples, what is today's northern Russia. And naturally, these places were backwards compared to Scandinavia. Right, Scandinavia, aside from these broader chronological lags, was still, soundly framed in Western military culture. These other areas were depressed for many obvious reasons. They were more harsh climatically, they were more difficult to reach, they were farther from civilization. The flat bow, simple construction, continued to be used in subarctic areas such as Lapland, and the reason being that it was apparently less sensitive to low temperatures compared to the longer simple bow. And that the flat bow basically has kind of an angular bending, and it's somewhat less performing, depending of course on the piece, but it was enough for the local environment. And naturally there were many Scandinavians who used it in these peripheral areas, because you see the Scandinavians kept expanding, of course, into these lands and dwelling there, and also being partly influenced by the local customs. The Finns at the time remained essentially tribal peoples without much of a social stratification, so that their military elite was somewhat poorly equipped. They had much in common with the Baltic people to their south, so it's literally a matter of colonization. You see, the Scandinavians joined the broader Drangnak Osten of the Germans, and they were connected with the broader Baltic trade, with again this in the broader Western activity. Other peoples were extremely primitive still, as you know, in the Baltic. Many tribal pagan peoples survived, and they came to be civilized through the same pressure that the Crusaders put on them, except some of them were exterminated in the process, but they never really completely disappeared. Many of their aristocracies also blended with in the frontier with the invaders. And there is an interesting evidence of Finnish military characteristics at the time. For example, there's a bronze sword hilt from Kiviniemi, dating to the 12th to the 13th century. And Finland was one of the last areas of Europe to be drawn into Western European military culture. The land, even among the Scandinavian colonists, remained quite primitive until even the late modern age. Right, there wasn't even a real direct way to control it. Where it was a very scarce social stratification. Slavery went on for a very long time until the 17th century, and mostly also controlled by Sweden. Of course, it was the country colonizing Finland, and the most, at least. So there are certain archaic technological and stylistic traditions that survived in Finland for long. A proof is this bronze sword hilt that, as we've seen, is somewhat very out-fashioned by this time. The pommel is very old-fashioned. The missing quillon are very broad. They may even be carved from horn, and this thing was seen also in Poland, for example, but still there is no comparison even with Poland in terms of development. There is a spearhead from Moscow, and we don't know whether it was from Finland at the time. We're talking about the 12th century, and this spear shows wings or flanges that are also very old-fashioned for most of 12th century Europe. The reason why it was still there probably is the preeminence of infantry. These wings or flanges tend to disappear when Western cavalry increases its collective effectiveness. So it's not about the single duel, or the knight is expected to dismount or to engage even in single combat on horseback, right? The idea is that if you smash with the entire formation, it's done. So you don't need flanges or anything. On the contrary, you really want that lance, hopefully, to stick deep, to transpass the enemy during the impetus of the charge. There are all ways to, first of all, squires would bring other spears, and that were used also a bit in many ways, but still they were mostly meant for that kind of charge and not for a prolonged fight, which they would pass to the swords often. Also because armor was also ever more resistant. Some say that this spearhead from Moscow may be ceremonial, however, so to have had some broader symbolism, for which it was, yes, an old-fashioned weapon, but not really used in combat. So, like very often, whatever you see as ceremonial is much closer to practical use than you may think, or at least it suggests that it's still a close idea, right, to use that type of weapon. We find also war axes in Finland dating from the 13th century. Some are of the Danish type, so suggesting, of course, that kind of Viking presence there and their typical military organization and panoply. It's the same aforementioned downward sweeping birded form, except this dating to the 13th century makes it very out of fashion, because in Europe at that point basically this type of weapon had disappeared, right? Until the 12th century, in places in fact like Scandinavia, like Britain, you find them. By the 13th century really doesn't make much sense, right? The formations have much more collectively functionalized. You don't have that individualistic type of ethos, except Finland may have maintained it for a longer time. There are also some way back influences, telling the truth, because when you colonize someone, you tend also to be, influenced by the local culture, not just the other way around. For example, there is a carved relief at the Skara Cathedral in Sweden, dating to the 1150s. It's there at the entrance of the sacristy, right? And there is it depicts at a point Herod and the cock, probably. And here King Herod's guards draw their swords because they are alarmed, and the depiction is quite crude, but you can see their tapering blades and relatively long quillon, which is somewhat early in time. But the Slav or Baltic influence here is shown by the hats or helmets, which have unusually tall pointed forms that are common actually to the east and the south of Sweden from the other side of the Baltic. Naturally, you have also abundant elite finds in Finland as well, connected with Scandinavia. There's a sword, for example, preserved at the National Museum of Helsinki, and this was possibly made in Götaland in the 13th century. It's a magnificent weapon. It was surely made, if not surely, very likely, at least in Sweden and or Götaland specifically. And the reason being that latter island was the hub of Baltic trade at the time. That's also why the Danes wanted to control it at the Battle of Visby. And the style is one of the typical 13th century sword. But it's so heavily decorated that once it was suggested it to be a ceremonial sword as well, right? And I told you what I think about it in general. The Perms to the east, like there are also a lot of other peoples that entered in contact with the Scandinavians that may have reached them also in this kind of what was a dynamic warfare. There were mercenaries entering in service of Scandinavian warlords on the Baltic coast and being called from far away or simply coming to fight against them. So there is all this very interesting frontier area. Perhaps we will see it a bit more in depth in some other video. We know the Perms used a lot of javelins, which still indicates a still primitive warfare, let's say, and a much more hand-to-hand, simple, primitive type of guerrilla style. The Karelians were partly nomadic, even. They had more in common with the Lapps, specifically. The coastal Finns were more Europeanized, let's say, especially by the 13th to 14th century. And you know that fundamentally what happened in those lands in terms of ethnic merging. The Lapps were connected with a broader economic circuit because they essentially imported everything in metal, including weapons from Scandinavia or from other advanced civilizations. The neighboring Finno-Ugrian peoples of the northern Ural region also seem to have relied on trade for iron, albeit these were closer also to the routes of the controlled by the Volga-Bulgars. I made a video about them and their warfare exactly at this point, and so they were a very advanced Islamic, say, ranging from quasi-feudal to semi-nomadic culture, developing in statehood and having an impressive military capacity and influence in the area until they were essentially curbed by the Mongols. The southernmost Finno-Ugrian tribes were, however, a bit more advanced. Also, even in the 11th century, you see that they had towns having thus an important surplus. Christianity had spread there already as well. There were important weapons that suggest also a discrete military potential. Definitely the least developed of all the Scandinavian neighbors were the so-called Skrælings, the Screamers, in Norse, so the far-flung western fringes of Greenland and North America, where Norse settlers and explorers met with the natives. As we were saying before, the Skrælings were actually is an umbrella term for a very wide amount of peoples, and also stretching, in fact, on an equally large amount of space. Eskimo hunters, subarctic American natives of upper Quebec and Labrador. Also, those tribes dwelling in the forests of Newfoundland, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and New England, that surely participated in this broader Scandinavian trade, especially during the Viking era, but also slightly later. But we know that these Skrælings preferred the iron objects, as we were pointing out before, because they had never really seen it. They were Stone Age, practically, people. And the trade was heavily oriented towards this goods that could, as you understand, provide also with an edge in tribal warfare sometimes, at least, maybe not so decisively just because of the weapons, but conferring a prestige that was enormous and that would favor some kind of greater centralization. They thought those weapons were somewhat magic. And at some point, the Scandinavian authorities even prohibited, in fact, exports to the Skrælings, either because there was a broader problem of smuggling, want to be a monopoly in the same Scandinavia, the Scandinavian pools of resources, etc., and also maybe because arming the Skrælings could be threatening towards the same Norse colonists in these lands. I will perhaps make a video about this more in detail, because again, we don't know that much about it, but still there is an historiography, there is a literature about that, and it would be interesting to get a bit more into details of this. In any case, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.